Okay, so last section on personality, we will be talking about what's called the social cognitive approach, personality, and the person-situation controversy. Talk about the concept of the locus of control, and talk about the self, self-verification, self-esteem, self-serving bias, implicit egotism, and narcissism. So some fun topics related to personality. So the social cognitive approach is one way to think about personality, and it's more thinking about the interactions between a person and situations that they encounter in life, rather than focusing on what traits that person possesses, but how they handle situations that they encounter. And at the core of this is what's called the person-situation controversy. And what this boils down to is whether how someone behaves is the result of their personality traits that they possess, things that are stable, or is it just due to the influence of the situation? So think about this a little bit. Do you think your behavior more often depends on the situation that you find yourself in, or your personality traits? You know, maybe some of those big five traits that we talked about. So if we were to kind of color this red and color one green, of course it's going to be a mix. It's more complex than one or the other. There's going to be a blend. It is true, research has shown that someone's behavior in one situation does predict similar behavior in a similar situation, but in some situations everyone's going to act the same. Doesn't matter what mix of the big five traits that they have. And there are some behaviors that just won't generalize to other situations. They're just very specific. So also related to the social cognitive approach is this concept of the locus of control. Right? So this deals with our perception of how in control we are of our lives and the rewards that we obtain throughout our life. And if we kind of think of a controller, like a game controller, you can either think that you are in control, you're possessing the controller, or you are being controlled. You're in the game and external forces are controlling you. So an internal locus of control is the perception that you can control your own destiny, whereas an external locus of control is that outcomes are random and the result of luck. This is a little quote from a poem that I thought of that relates to this by William Ernest Henley. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. That would be more of an internal locus of control. And all we are is dust in the wind. That's more of an external locus of control kind of thought. Okay, that we're controlled by external factors. This survey is in your textbook, and it's a good idea to just go through each of these and make sure you're comfortable with identifying this relates more to an internal locus of control versus which ones indicate an external locus of control. It's a good idea to go through this and actually fill out the survey and see kind of where you're at. As far as which one is better, research suggests that having an internal locus of control, being more biased towards that side of the spectrum, means that you're better able to cope with stress, you tend to achieve more in life, and you have less anxiety. Okay, so let's shift gears just a little bit, talking about the self. When we're studying personality, one way is to just do some self-examination and examining how people think about themselves as opposed to how they think about others, which is also important. But we have this self-concept, what we know about ourselves, how we would describe ourselves. Self-verification is we tend to seek evidence that confirms that self-concept. If we believe that we are a certain way, that our personality is a certain way, that we're say that we're a good leader, for example, we tend to seek evidence that we are a good leader. If there's evidence to the contrary, we may try to project project behaviors that suggest that we're a good leader and try to kind of amplify those to confirm that self-concept. Okay, so here's a couple questions just to think about. Would you consider yourself a better than average driver? If you're thinking about yourself and your own behavior and personality. Here's kind of a related question, and this is kind of a tricky one. Do you believe the following statement? Fully 68% of American school children are performing below the national average. So the reason why I do these polls is at least last semester, I get a little over half, at least over 50% that agree or strongly agree that they're better than an average driver. And if you think about that, you can't have more than half of people who are better than average. It just doesn't work out mathematically. So this is just a made-up statement, Pew Forum. I don't even know if that's a real thing. Just a mathematical impossibility. However, when you give people questions like this, you'll get upwards of 80, 90% of people who think that they're a better than average driver or a better than average professor or better than average at their job. So this connects to what's called the self-serving bias. We tend to be pretty favorable towards ourselves. So we tend to think that we're better than average. This is a quote that's from a radio show called The Prairie Home Companion. This fictional town called Lake Wobegon, and the quote is always said when the radio show airs, well, that's the news from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all the children are above average. So we all tend to think, on average, we tend to think that we're above average. We also tend to take credit for our successes, downplay responsibility for failure. If you do well on an exam, you tend to think, well, that's because I studied hard and I'm smart. If we do poorly on an exam, then we tend to think the test was unfair and all these factors outside of my control made it so I failed. So self-esteem, esteeming ourselves. Humans overall tend to have high self-esteem, and we'll talk about why is that. There's a few reasons that psychologists think. Why is it advantageous for us to overall be thinking well of ourselves? So one reason could be social status, that if we have high self-esteem, it may trigger others to treat us with more respect. There's definitely some societal advantage to that. One reason may be belongingness. Higher self-esteem might, if we think of ourselves highly, then that often equates with feeling included, and we have an inner need to belong. If we tend to think well of ourselves, we also tend to think that other people think well of us and that we're part of the group. And then there's this idea that we maybe think highly of ourselves and try to inflate our self-esteem a little bit to deal with the terror of our own mortality, that we're all going to die, and that may be one way to cope with it, kind of a terror management tactic. Implicit egotism is an interesting phenomenon that's been observed. Of all the states in the Union, if you are named George, you're more likely to live in Georgia. There's a higher probability of living in Georgia than in the other states. And I imagine I don't know if this has been looked at, but there's probably a disproportionate number of Georgias in St. George as well. So we tend to have a preference for things that are like us. More people named Paul living in St. Paul, etc. Most people say that it's more likely that your favorite letter of the alphabet is the letter that is the first letter of your name. And sometimes this gets all this grandiose view of the self, or this esteeming ourselves. Sometimes it gets blown out of proportion, and this is referred to as narcissism. Too high of self-esteem, where you just really have this inflated view. Emperor Kuzco from The Emperor's New Groove, I think, is a great example of this. So I have a few questions that I would normally do a little poll on Socrative with, but I will post those as a practice quiz on Canvas, so you can go over that. That won't be for a grade, just something that you can use to check for understanding. All right.